My name is Walt Brannigan. I'm 71 years old, and for 41 of those years, I sold insurance out of a storefront on Front Street in Marietta, Ohio, 2 blocks up from where the Muskingum runs into the Ohio River. I want to tell you about the worst Tuesday of my life. Not the day my wife died. That one doesn't belong in this story, and I won't cheapen it by putting it next to what I'm about to tell you. I mean the Tuesday I got walked out of my own agency by a man I taught how to write a commercial policy. His name is Kurt. He's my son-in-law. He's been sitting at the desk across from mine for 15 years, and on that Tuesday, he stood in the doorway of my own office with a folder in his hand and told me, real gentle, real sorry-sounding, that Dr. Sheffield's report had come back, and that for my own safety and Denise's peace of mind, I should go on home and rest, and we'd talk everything through once things settled down. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 11 minutes. I watched my own name, Brannigan Insurance and Financial, gold letters, 41 years old, through my own windshield, and I felt something in my chest that I want to describe honestly to you, because there's no dignity in dressing it up. It felt like drowning, standing up. I didn't know it yet, sitting in that truck. But 15 years earlier, on the same afternoon, I'd signed over a third of that agency to the young man who'd just walked me out of it. I had also signed something else, something Kurt had never read, something my own daughter didn't know existed. A single paragraph, 4 sentences long, sitting quiet in a trust document in a fireproof box in my hall closet. They thought they were taking my business away from me that Tuesday. They had no idea they just pulled the trigger on the one document built to take everything away from them.
Before I tell you what that paragraph said, I need you to know who I was before any of this started. Because if you only meet me in that parking lot, you'll think I'm a victim. And I was never that. Not really. I was a man who built something with his hands and his patience over 4 decades, and I want you to see it standing before I show you it torn down. I grew up the son of a barge pilot on the Ohio River. My father worked the coal boats, and some nights he didn't come home till after I was asleep, smelling like diesel and river water. I decided early I wanted work that let me sleep in my own bed every night of my life. Insurance seemed about as far from a barge as a man could get. I started at 19, running paperwork for an agency 2 doors down from where mine would eventually stand, for a man named Chester Voss. Chester taught me the trade the old way. No computers, no actuarial software, just index cards and a green ledger and a memory for every family in 3 counties. He used to say, "Walt, we don't sell insurance. We sell a promise that we'll still be standing there when the bad thing happens." I believed him. I still do. I bought my own agency in 1984 with a loan from the Marietta National Bank and $11,000 my wife Lorraine and I had saved from her teaching salary and my 9 years working claims investigation for the state insurance department, which I'll get back to, because it matters more than you'd think for a man who spent his last 20 years selling homeowners policies to Rivertown families. I want to tell you about Lorraine, because she's in this story even though she's been gone 3 years now. She taught 4th grade at Washington Elementary for 31 years. She was the one who told me, back in 1991 when I was thinking of selling out to a regional chain that offered me real money, that Brannigan Agency wasn't a business. It was a promise with our name on it, and you don't sell your name. I didn't sell. We had 1 daughter, Denise, smart as her mother, stubborn as me. She went to Ohio University for accounting, came back home at 24 with a CPA license,
and a boyfriend named Kurt Hale, a good-looking kid from Belpre who'd been selling cars at the Chevy dealership on Pike Street and talking, even then, about wanting to do something bigger with his life. I liked Kurt. I want to be honest about that, because it's important you understand I wasn't a man who got fooled by an obvious villain. Kurt was charming in a way that never once felt like a performance to me. He remembered every client's kid's name. He showed up at 7 in the morning without being asked. And when Denise brought him around for Sunday dinner, he asked me real questions about the business, not polite ones. What's your loss ratio on the commercial book? How do you handle a claim you suspect is fraudulent? I thought, here's a boy who could actually run this place someday. They married in 2003. I gave Kurt a job in claims processing that same year, and I trained him myself, same as Chester trained me. No shortcuts, no software doing the thinking for him. By 2009, he was writing his own commercial policies. By 2011, I made him a minority partner, 30% of the agency, in exchange for a note he'd pay off over 10 years out of his draw. I did that because I was proud of him. I want you to remember that I did that because I was proud of him, because it's going to be hard to hold on to later in this story. Here's the part I need you to sit with, because it's the whole hinge of everything that comes after. In 2013, an old friend of mine, a fellow agent 2 counties over named Roy Talmadge, got squeezed out of the business he'd built by his own business partner. Nothing illegal on paper. The partner had gotten Roy's signature on a restructuring document while Roy was recovering from a stroke, changed the operating agreement, and by the time Roy's family figured out what had happened, Roy owned 8% of a company he'd built from nothing, and the partner owned the rest, plus the building. Roy never got a dime back. He died 2 years later in an apartment above a laundromat in Parkersburg, and I went to that funeral, and I sat in the back pew, and I thought about every year I'd spent as a state fraud investigator, watching men do exactly this kind of thing to other men, dressed up as paperwork, and I thought, that will never happen to me. Not because I don't trust my daughter's husband, because I trust nobody with a signature they can change later without my say-so.
That week, I drove to Columbus and sat down with an estate attorney named Priscilla Nagy, a woman I'd worked alongside back in my state investigator days before she went into private elder law practice. I told her what I wanted, not because I suspected Kurt, because I'd learned, over 9 years of investigating fraud, that the men who get robbed blind are never the ones who trusted the wrong person. They're the ones who never built a lock in the first place. Priscilla drew up a trust. The agency, the building on Front Street, and my personal accounts all went into it. The Walter and Lorraine Brannigan Family Trust, with Lorraine and me as co-trustees, and language for what would happen if either of us became incapacitated or if the trusteeship ever changed hands. And buried in Article 7, Section 3, subsection C, was this: 4 sentences in plain English that Priscilla insisted on writing in plain English instead of legal Latin, because she said a document like this only works if a judge can read it out loud and understand it the first time. I'm not going to tell you what it said yet. I'm going to tell you when it mattered, because that's how it happened to me, and I think you deserve to feel it the way I felt it. I signed that trust on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2013. I told Lorraine. I did not tell Denise. I did not tell Kurt. Not out of suspicion, out of the plain fact that a lock you tell the household about isn't a lock, it's a suggestion. I want you to hold on to that document. We're going to leave it in the closet for a while now, same as I did, and I'm going to show you how a good man slides into becoming somebody who takes advantage of his own father-in-law, one small step at a time, the same way I've watched it happen in 100 families that weren't mine. Lorraine got sick in the spring of 2020. Ovarian cancer, stage 3 by the time they caught it. And I want to skip past the worst of those 18 months. Not because I'm ashamed of them, but because grief isn't the point of this story. and I won't hand it to you like it's entertainment. What matters is this. For 18 months, I was not running my agency. I was in oncology waiting rooms in Columbus. I was learning how to give injections at our kitchen table. I was, for the first time in 40 years, not the man watching the books. Kurt stepped up. I'll say that plainly because it's true, and because a man who only tells you the bad half of a story is lying to you by omission. Kurt ran the office. He handled renewals, he handled claims, he handled the 2 employees we had left after I'd let our office manager retire in 2018. He drove Denise to Columbus twice so she could sit with her mother while I slept in a hospital recliner. I was grateful to him. I told him so more than once. Lorraine died on the 4th of November, 2021, at 4:40 in the afternoon at the James Cancer Hospital, with Denise holding one of her hands and me holding the other. I did not go back to the office full-time after that. I want to be honest with you about why, because it's not flattering. I didn't have the stomach for it. I'd sit down at my old desk and I'd see the framed photo Lorraine kept there of the 2 of us at the grand opening in 1984. And some days, I couldn't make it past 9 in the morning before I had to go sit in my truck in the parking lot. The same parking lot, isn't that something? And just breathe for a while. So I stepped back. Not out, back. I told Kurt and Denise I wanted to be what I called advisory. In 3 days a week, reviewing the big commercial accounts personally, because that's the part of the business I'd never trusted to anyone else. Staying out of the day-to-day the rest of the time. Kurt took over as managing partner in practice, though on paper the trust still owned 60% and I was still a co-trustee, now the sole trustee since Lorraine had passed. I want to tell you about the first small thing, because these things are always small at first, and if I'd caught it then, none of the rest of this would have happened. In February of 2022, I asked to see the commercial renewals book, the ledger of our biggest accounts, the lumberyard, the marina, the 2 nursing homes we'd insured for 11 years. Kurt told me the agency had gone to a new digital system, said the state was pushing everybody toward electronic filing, and that the login I'd need was tied up in a software migration, but he'd get me access next week. Next week came. Then it was the vendors working out some bugs. Then it was March, and I'd stopped asking, because grief makes a man tired in ways that have nothing to do with sleep, and I let it go.
That's the whole secret to how any of this works, by the way, if you're listening to this and wondering how a sharp man like me let it happen. It's never one big lie, it's 100 small ones, each one small enough that objecting to it makes you feel unreasonable. I've watched 100 families do this to their elders in my old line of work, and I did not, for one single day, believe it was happening to me until I was standing in the parking lot. By the fall of 2022, I noticed Kurt had started referring to the agency in casual conversation as the company, not your dad's company or even the family business. Small thing. I noted it and did nothing, because noting things and doing nothing about them is the exact hinge this whole story swings on, and I want you to feel how easy that hinge is to fall through. In January of 2023, Denise and Kurt came to Sunday dinner. I still hosted Sunday dinner, same table Lorraine and I bought in 1988, and Kurt brought a folder. "Pop," he said. He'd called me Pop since about year 3 of the marriage, and I'd always liked it. "We want to talk about succession planning. Not because anything's wrong, because you deserve to enjoy retirement without worrying about the office." I I want you to hear how reasonable that sounds. I want you to hear it the way I heard it, sitting at my own table with a pot roast Denise had made from her mother's recipe. Because if it doesn't sound reasonable to you, I haven't told this part right. The folder had a proposal. Kurt would buy out the remaining 30% I still held personally, separate from the trust's 60, over 5 years, at a valuation his accountant had prepared. I'd remain a trustee of the family trust, drawing an income from the building lease, but day-to-day authority would transfer entirely to Kurt as managing partner and eventual majority owner. Here is the thing I want you to understand about myself in that moment, because I think it's the most honest thing I can tell you. I wanted to say yes. Not because the numbers were fair. I found out later they weren't, not close. But because I was so tired, and my wife was gone, and my son-in-law was sitting across my dinner table offering to carry a weight I no longer had the strength to carry. And some part of every grieving man wants somebody, anybody, to just take it. I told them I'd think about it. I did not sign that Sunday. Priscilla Nagy, my old attorney, still handled my personal estate matters, though she'd mostly retired by then and handed most of her caseload to a younger partner. I called her anyway. She read the buyout proposal over the phone while I sat in my kitchen with the radio off, and she was quiet for a long moment. And then she said something I've thought about every day since. "Walt, this values the agency's book of business at $1.4 million. You told me 2 years ago your commercial accounts alone were doing $900,000 a year in written premium. Something's wrong with this number, or something's wrong with the books it's based on." I didn't sign. I told Kurt I needed more time, that grief had me slower than usual, that I wasn't ready to make big decisions yet. He was gracious about it. I want to be fair, he never once pushed. He said, "Take all the time you need, Pop." And I believed him, because there was no reason not to. But something shifted after that dinner. It was subtle enough that I doubted myself for the better part of a year. Client calls that used to come to me started going straight to Kurt. I'd hear from old friends, Herm Costello, who ran the marina, Dwayne Pruitt at the lumber yard, that they hadn't heard from me directly in a while, and I'd laugh it off, say I was easing into retirement. Denise started coming to Sunday dinner alone more often. Kurt's got a renewal deadline, and when she was there, our conversations felt rehearsed in a way I couldn't name yet. She'd ask how I was sleeping. She'd ask if I'd been keeping up with my blood pressure medication. She'd mention, almost in passing, that Dad's memory seemed a little foggier lately, didn't I think? And I'd say no. I felt sharp as ever, and she'd say, "Of course, Dad," in a voice that didn't sound like she believed me. In August of 2023, I had a small stroke. I want to be precise about this because it matters enormously to what comes next. It was what's called a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, sometimes called a mini-stroke. I was in the agency parking lot of all places, and my left hand went numb for about 4 minutes, and I got dizzy enough that Ashlyn, one of the younger girls in the office, found me and called an ambulance. I spent one night in Marietta Memorial. The neurologist, a good doctor named Farrow, ran a full workup, said the TIA had resolved with no lasting damage, put me on a blood thinner, and told me those things are a serious warning sign, but not, on their own, evidence of anything more. Denise and Kurt were both there when I was discharged. Denise cried in the hospital hallway, and I remember feeling grateful, genuinely grateful, that my daughter still loved me enough to be frightened for me. I still believe that fear was real. I want to say that clearly, because not everything in this story is a performance. And I think the saddest part of what happened is that some of it wasn't. But 2 weeks after that hospital stay, Kurt mentioned, gentle as anything, that maybe it'd be good for me to talk to somebody. Not because anything's wrong, Pop,
just to have a baseline. A geriatric psychiatrist in Athens named Dr. Marcus Sheffield, who did cognitive evaluations. I said sure, I didn't see the harm. I'd had a health scare. Getting checked out seemed like plain good sense. I saw Dr. Sheffield in September. He asked me what day it was. He asked me to draw a clock face and mark the hands at 11:10. He asked me to remember 3 words: apple, table, penny, and repeat them back to him 5 minutes later. I did all of it fine. I remember him nodding, writing notes, telling me my cognition looked entirely intact for a man of 70, that the stroke didn't appear to have caused any impairment, and that he'd send his report to my doctor and to Kurt, since Kurt had made the referral and asked to be copied. I didn't think anything of that last part. Kurt made the appointment. Of course he'd want to know the results. I want you to notice how many times in this story a thing seemed like plain good sense. I did not know, I would not know for another 8 months, that Dr. Sheffield's report Kurt received was not the same report Kurt showed to Denise, and was not the same report that would, eventually, get filed with a probate court. In the spring of 2024, I finally got my hands on the digital books, more or less by accident. Ashlyn, the young woman who'd found me in the parking lot the year before, was leaving the agency for a job at a bank in Parkersburg, and on her last week, she came to me privately, after hours, and asked if we could talk in my truck instead of the office. I want to tell you about Ashlyn, because she matters to this story more than almost anybody. She told me, sitting in my truck with the engine running for the heat, that she'd been doing the agency's monthly reconciliations for 2 years, and that something had bothered her for the last several months that she hadn't known how to say out loud, because Kurt was her boss, and Kurt had always been decent to her. She told me there were policies in the commercial book, 9 of them that she'd found, written to businesses she couldn't verify existed. A Riverside Fabricators LLC, a Muskingum Valley Cold Storage, real-sounding names, real-looking policy numbers, premiums collected and recorded as paid. But when she'd tried, out of simple bookkeeping curiosity, to pull up the physical addresses listed for 2 of them, one came back as a vacant lot on Route 60, and the other was a nail salon that had never heard of any cold storage business. She told me the premiums on those 9 policies totaled around $11,000 a month. She told me that every few months, one of them would get canceled and refunded, and a new one with a similar name would appear, and the cancellation refunds never seemed to be back to any client. They got processed as internal adjustments. I sat in that truck for a long time before I said anything. I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner. She said, and this is the sentence I have not been able to stop turning over since, "Mr. Brannigan, I didn't think you still had access to see it, and I didn't know if telling you would get me fired before I could give my 2 weeks." I told her thank you. I told her I'd take it from here. I gave her the name and number of a good friend, an insurance regulator I still knew from my old state days, in case she ever wanted a reference that had nothing to do with Kurt Hale. And I drove home, and I did not sleep that night, not 1 hour of it. This is the turning point of the whole story. Deliver with weight. Here's what I want you to understand about the next 6 weeks, because it's the part of this story where I stopped being a grieving old man easing into retirement and started being, again, the thing I'd spent 9 years of my life trained to be. I did not confront Kurt. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy, not at first. It was fear. Real, plain fear. The kind that makes a 71-year-old man's hands shake on a steering wheel. Because the ledger Ashlyn described to me wasn't just theft. It was theft dressed up carefully enough that if I raised it wrong, in the wrong room, with the wrong evidence, I would be the one who looked confused. An old man with a recent stroke making wild accusations against the son-in-law who'd been running his business for 2 years. I had sat across the table from enough elderly claimants in my working life to know exactly how that story gets told by everyone except the old man at the center of it. So I did what I'd trained 31 years of young investigators to do before I was one of the old men in the story instead. I gathered quietly, and I told almost no one. I called Priscilla Nagy. She was 78 by then, fully retired, living outside Athens with her husband and a garden she was prouder of than any case she'd ever won. But she agreed to meet me for coffee, off the books, as a friend. I told her everything Ashlyn had described. I told her about the buyout proposal from the year before, valuing the agency far below what its real numbers should have supported. Priscilla went quiet, in the way she used to go quiet right before she told a client something they didn't want to hear. "Walt," she said, "I think your son-in-law's been skimming premium through phantom commercial accounts. And I think he needed the real valuation to look low so he could buy control of the agency cheap before anyone looked closely at the books. And I think," she said, "you need to remember exactly what we put in Article 7 back in 2013. I want to tell you I remembered it instantly, warm with relief, like a movie. I didn't. I'd signed that trust 11 years earlier, and, God's honest truth, I'd have forgotten the specifics. Priscilla drove home and pulled her old files. She'd kept copies of everything, thank God, a habit from 30 years of getting burned by clients who lost paperwork. And she read it to me over the phone that same night. Article 7, Section 3, Subsection C of the Walter and Lorraine Brannigan Family Trust, dated March 14, 2013. In the event the trusteeship of this trust or controlling ownership interest in any operating business held by this trust is proposed to transfer by any means, including but not limited to voluntary sale, court-ordered guardianship, incapacity determination, or emergency conservatorship, such transfer shall not become effective until an independent, licensed forensic accountant selected by the Ohio Department of Insurance from its approved vendor list has completed a full audit of the business's financial records for the preceding 5 years, at the expense of the trust, with results filed as a matter of public record with the probate court overseeing the transfer. I sat in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I felt, for the first time since that stroke in the parking lot, something other than fear. I felt like a man who'd built a lock 11 years before he needed it, and had just found the key still hanging exactly where he'd left it. But I want to tell you the breaking point wasn't that phone call. The breaking point came 3 days later, on a Thursday in June, when Denise called me, voice tight, careful, rehearsed in that way I'd started to recognize, and told me that she and Kurt had spoken to Dr. Sheffield again, that they were concerned, that they'd consulted an elder law attorney of their own, a man named Farrell Bick out of Columbus, about options to protect the business and Dad's well-being, and that a petition might be filed with the Washington County Probate Court seeking a limited guardianship over my financial affairs. She said it gently. She said, "We just love you, Dad, and we're scared." And here is the thing I need you to sit with, because I have sat with it every day since. I believe she meant it. I believe my daughter, who I raised at that kitchen table, who I taught to ride a bike on 4th Street, genuinely believed, in that moment, that she was protecting me. I don't know to this day how much of the fraud she knew about, and how much she'd been told a story just persuasive enough to let her believe she was saving her father instead of helping rob him. That's the breaking point. Not rage, something worse. The specific grief of understanding that the people trying to take everything from you might not even know that's what they're doing. I did not raise my voice on that phone call with Denise. I told her I understood her concerns, that I loved her too, and that I'd be happy to sit down with everyone, including her lawyer, whenever it was convenient. I hung up the phone, and then I went and sat in Lorraine's old reading chair by the window, the one I'd never had the heart to get rid of, and I let myself feel every bit of it for about 20 minutes. Then I called Priscilla back. Here's what we did, and I want to walk you through it carefully, because I think the way we did it matters as much as what we did. First, Priscilla confirmed with the Washington County Probate Court Clerk's office, a public inquiry, nothing that would tip anyone off, that no guardianship petition had yet been filed under my name. We had time, but we didn't know how much. Second, she pulled the original 2013 trust document, notarized and recorded, and confirmed the Article 7 language was airtight, that controlling ownership interest in any operating business clearly covered a guardianship-triggered transfer, not just a voluntary sale, because she'd specifically drafted it broad enough to cover exactly this scenario, all those years ago, thinking of Roy Talmadge the whole time she wrote it. Third, and this is the part I want you to really hear, because it's the part that took nerve I wasn't sure I still had. Priscilla told me that if I wanted this to work the way it was designed to work, I could not go to Kurt or Denise and warn them. I could not confront Kurt about the phantom policies. I could not do anything that would make them abandon the guardianship petition and try some other route instead. The whole design of that trust clause depended on them coming after my competency through the courts, because that was the only trigger that would force the audit into a public record a judge had to read. "Walt," she said, "you built a trap that only springs if they step exactly where they're already planning to step. Don't warn the deer." I didn't like that phrase. I use it anyway, because it's honest about what I had to become for about 6 weeks. A man watching people I loved walk toward something and choosing not to stop them, because stopping them would only mean they'd find a different way to hurt me, one with no locks built into it. Fourth, we quietly retained a forensic accountant, not the state's eventual court-appointed one, but a private one Priscilla trusted, a woman named Inez Calloway out of Cincinnati, to do our own shadow review, so that if the guardianship petition came and triggered the court-ordered audit, I would already understand what it was likely to find, and wouldn't be walking into that courtroom blind. Inez worked from copies of bank statements I was still legally entitled to as trustee. That's an important detail, because as trustee of my own trust, even semi-retired, I still had the right to request the agency's banking records, a right Kurt hadn't yet figured out how to take from me, because taking it would have required the very guardianship petition he hadn't filed yet. It took Inez 11 days. When she called Priscilla with her preliminary findings, Priscilla called me, and I remember exactly where I was standing, in my own kitchen, dish towel over my shoulder, because I'd been doing dishes when the phone rang, which felt like such a small, stupid human thing to be doing in the middle of the worst month of my life.
Inez had found roughly $340,000 over 3 years, moved through 9 phantom commercial policies, refunded as internal adjustments, and traced through a data broker report and some very careful subpoena-free digging, Priscilla was quick to remind me was the very outer edge of legal, to a personal LLC account controlled by Kurt Hale, one he'd opened in 2021, the same year he'd started helping with the books full-time while Lorraine was sick. She'd also found something I didn't expect. Kurt had a second business, a used auto lot outside Belpre he'd quietly invested in back in 2020 that had gone under in 2022, leaving him personally on the hook for roughly $280,000 in inventory financing he'd personally guaranteed.
The timeline lined up close enough to turn my stomach. My son-in-law hadn't done this because he was cruel. He'd done it because he was drowning in a debt he was too proud to admit to anybody, and my agency's premium float looked, to a desperate man, like a loan he intended to pay back eventually, before anybody noticed. I want to tell you that made it easier to forgive. It didn't, not then. But it made it something other than simple. And I think that matters, because nothing in this story was ever simple. Not even the villain. The guardianship petition was filed on the 9th of July, 2024, in Washington County Probate Court. Farrell Bick, the Columbus attorney, filed it on behalf of Denise Hale, asking for a limited financial guardianship over me, citing the TIA, Dr. Sheffield's evaluation, and what the petition called escalating confusion and disorganized record-keeping observed by family and staff. I want to tell you what it felt like to be served those papers, because I think it's important not to skip past it. A sheriff's deputy I'd known socially for 15 years, a good man named Deputy Orville Steckel, came to my door on a Tuesday afternoon and looked like he wanted to apologize for his own existence the whole time he handed me the envelope. I invited him in for coffee. He said he couldn't, procedure, and drove off looking over his shoulder at me twice before he got to his cruiser. I read that petition at my kitchen table. It described me, in places, as a man who'd been found wandering near the agency parking lot in a state of apparent disorientation the day of my stroke, described in a way that made it sound like something else entirely. It quoted Dr. Sheffield's evaluation, but selectively, pulling phrases about some age-appropriate cognitive changes worth monitoring, while leaving out his conclusion that I showed no clinical impairment. It cited the failed buyout negotiations from the year before, framing my hesitation to sign as evidence of difficulty processing complex financial decisions, rather than what it actually was, which was me being suspicious of a lowball number correctly. Here is the part that hurt worst, and I'll say it plainly. My own daughter's name was on that petition as the petitioner. Not Kurt's, Denise's. Farrell Bick explained, later, in his opening remarks, that Ohio law generally favors a family member over a professional guardian when one's available and willing, and Kurt, as my son-in-law rather than blood relation, would have had a harder time petitioning directly. So they put Denise's name on it. My daughter asked a court to declare her own father incompetent, and I don't know, to this day, how much she understood about what that request was truly protecting. Priscilla filed our response within the 10 days state law allowed. We requested a jury. Ohio allows it in a contested guardianship, though almost nobody exercises the right, same as it is most everywhere, because old men are tired and scared, and their lawyers tell them it costs more and takes longer, and mostly they're right. I demanded it anyway. Priscilla warned me it would be the hardest few months of my life. I told her I'd already had the hardest years of my life, and I intended to be standing at the end of these ones. And critically, this is the piece I want you to really understand. The moment that petition was filed and accepted by the court, Article 7 of my trust activated automatically. Not because I asked for it to, because the trust document itself defined any petition seeking guardianship or conservatorship over the trustee as a qualifying trigger event. And Ohio probate courts, once a guardianship petition names a trust as an asset under dispute, are required to review the trust's own governing terms as part of determining jurisdiction and next steps. Priscilla filed a simple 3-page motion informing the court of Article 7's existence and requesting the court order the mandated forensic audit at the trust's expense, before any guardianship determination could proceed to affect ownership or control of the agency. Judge Corinne Aldis, presiding, reviewed it, found the language unambiguous, and ordered the audit, through the Ohio Department of Insurance's approved vendor list, exactly as Article 7 specified, with results due to the court within 90 days, and the guardianship hearing itself scheduled for the date after. Kurt and Farrell Bick, I later learned, tried to argue the audit was unnecessary and prejudicial, an old man's paranoid legal trap with no bearing on the competency question at hand. Judge Aldis, according to Priscilla, who was in the room, looked at both attorneys over her glasses and said, "Counselor, I don't much care why Mr. Brannigan wrote this 11 years ago. I care that he wrote it, that it's valid, recorded, and directly on point, and that this court doesn't get to ignore a person's own legal instruments just because they're inconvenient to the petition in front of me."
The audit was ordered for a state-approved forensic accountant, a man named Desmond Ruiz, out of the Department of Insurance's Cleveland office, entirely independent of Inez Callaway, whose private findings we kept confidential, in reserve, in case the state audit somehow came back soft. It didn't come back soft. I want to tell you about the 90 days between the audit order and Desmond Ruiz's findings, because it was the strangest stretch of my life. I still lived in my own house. I still, by court order pending the guardianship hearing, retained my legal rights, including trusteeship, since the guardianship hadn't been granted yet. Only the audit had been triggered. Denise called twice a week, always gentle, always sounding like a daughter checking in, and I answered every call, and I never once told her what Inez Callaway had found, and I never once asked her what she knew. I saw Kurt exactly once during those 90 days, at a Kroger on Pike Street, both of us standing at opposite ends of the same aisle for what felt like a full minute before either of us moved. He nodded at me. I nodded back. Neither of us said a word. I remember thinking, watching him from 20 feet of cereal boxes, that he looked thinner than I'd ever seen him, and that his hands, when he reached for a box on the shelf, were shaking slightly, the way mine had shaken in my truck the day Ashlyn told me everything. I don't say that to make you feel sorry for him. I say it because I want to be honest that I felt something complicated watching it. And I think pretending I felt only satisfaction would be a lie. And I promised you I wouldn't lie to you in this story. Desmond Ruiz's audit took 86 days. His report ran to 211 pages. I have read all of it, more than once. I'll spare you most of it, but the summary findings, filed with Washington County Probate Court on the 12th of October 2024, stated the following, and I'm going to read you the language close to how it appeared, because after everything, I think the plain words deserve to be heard plainly. 9 commercial insurance policies written between January 2021 and April 2024 showed no verifiable underlying insured business at the listed address. Total premiums collected on these policies across the period, $341,650. Of that amount, $298,400 had been processed as internal cancellation refunds and routed through 2 intermediate transfers to an LLC account, Hale Automotive Holdings, controlled solely by Kurt Hale. The remaining amount appeared to have been used to partially service a defaulted inventory financing loan connected to a used car dealership, Riverfront Motors, that had ceased operations in March of 2022. The report additionally noted, and this part, Priscilla told me later, was the sentence that changed everything in that courtroom, that Dr. Marcus Sheffield's psychiatric evaluation of me dated September 2023, when compared against the version filed as an exhibit with the guardianship petition, showed material alterations. Specifically, a paragraph present in the original file copy stating, "Patient demonstrates full cognitive function with no evidence of impairment attributable to the reported TIA," had been omitted from the version submitted to the court, and a different paragraph describing some age-related changes warranting monitoring, pulled from an unrelated section of the same document discussing general risk factors for a man of 70, had been repositioned to appear as the report's concluding assessment. Desmond Ruiz's report did not accuse anyone of forgery. That wasn't his mandate, and forensic accountants are careful people who stay in their lane. But it laid two documents side by side, the original and the filed version, and let a judge draw her own conclusion. This is the climax. Deliver with gravity and control. Courtroom energy, not rushed. The guardianship hearing convened on November 4th, 2024, in Courtroom 2 of the Washington County Courthouse, the same courthouse where I'd once testified in 11 different fraud cases as a young state investigator, 40 years earlier, sitting on the same wooden benches, though I don't imagine anybody in that room that day but me knew that. Judge Aldis had already received Desmond Ruiz's audit as a filed exhibit before the hearing even opened. She began by addressing it directly, which Priscilla told me afterward was unusual. But Judge Aldis was not, by reputation, a woman who enjoyed wasting a courtroom's time. "Before we proceed to competency testimony," she said, "I want counsel for the petitioner to explain to me why a forensic audit ordered by this court, pursuant to a valid trust provision, has identified over $300,000 in apparent misappropriated funds connected to the very business interests at the center of this guardianship request, and why the psychiatric evaluation submitted with this petition does not match the original clinical record." I want you to understand what that moment felt like, because I've turned it over in my mind more times than I can count. Farrell Bick stood up, and for the first time in every filing I'd read from him, he did not have a smooth answer. He asked for a recess. Judge Aldis granted 15 minutes. Kurt and Denise sat together at the petitioner's table during that recess. I sat at my own table next to Priscilla, and I did not look at them. Not because I couldn't bear to, but because Priscilla had told me, quietly, before we walked in that morning, "Whatever happens in there, Walt, let it happen without you reacting. This isn't the moment for your face to say anything at all." When the recess ended, Farrell Bick informed the court that his clients wished to withdraw the guardianship petition. Judge Aldis denied the request to simply withdraw, on the grounds that the audit findings raised questions of potential fraud that the court had an independent obligation to refer, regardless of whether the original petition continued, and that a withdrawal at this stage would not resolve the outstanding financial and evidentiary questions now on the record. She was, Priscilla told me later, essentially saying, "You don't get to open this door and then just walk back out of it once you don't like what's behind it." Denise was called first. Not as a defendant in any criminal sense. This was still technically a civil guardianship proceeding, but as the petitioner, required to explain the basis for her filing under oath. I watched my daughter sit in that witness chair in a navy blue dress I remembered her buying for Lorraine's memorial service, and I watched her hands folded in her lap, and I watched her look for one single moment directly at me before Farrell Bick asked his first question. And in that look, I understood something I will carry the rest of my life. She was as surprised by Desmond Ruiz's report as I had once been by Ashlyn's ledger. My daughter had not known. Not the full amount. Not the phantom policies. She'd known her husband was stressed. Known money was tight in ways he wouldn't explain. Known, I believe now,
that something wasn't sitting right, in the vague and terrible way a person knows a house has a smell of gas without being able to say from which room. But she had not known the number 341,650. And watching that number land on her in open court from a stranger's official report instead of her own husband's mouth was the cruelest thing I witnessed in that entire proceeding, crueler even than what came for Kurt. Priscilla asked her on cross-examination one question that mattered more than any other. "Mrs. Hale, prior to filing this petition, did you personally review your father's business bank records, or did you rely on financial summaries prepared by your husband?" Denise was quiet for 11 seconds. I counted them, the way I've counted every hard silence in my life since my time as an investigator taught me that 11 seconds is a very long time in a courtroom.
"I relied on Kurt," she finally said. Kurt was called next. I want to tell you what he looked like walking to that stand, because I'd known him for 21 years, and I had never once seen him look like that. Not thinner, I mean something closer to unmade, like a man who'd been holding a physical shape together through effort alone and had finally run out of the effort. Farrell Bick, to his credit, did not try to defend the indefensible. He asked Kurt to explain, in his own words, the 9 commercial policies. Kurt looked at the table for a long time. Then he looked at me. The first time he'd looked at me directly since that Tuesday I'd been walked out of my own office. And he said, "I was going to pay it back before anyone had to know. I thought I had more time. I thought if I could just get through this year." And he stopped because Judge Aldis, not unkindly, told him he needed to answer the specific question asked rather than explain his intentions. And I watched a 50-year-old man who had once taught himself my entire insurance ledger system in 11 months, faster than any employee I ever had, sit in a wooden chair and admit, piece by piece, exactly how he had done it, and why, and for how long. I did not go to him. I want you to know how badly some part of me wanted to, the same complicated animal part of any father-in-law who watched a young man grow into the family for 2 decades. I wanted to cross that room and put a hand on his shoulder the way you would for anyone drowning in front of you, guilty or not. I did not move. Priscilla had been right. That was not the moment for my face, or my hands, to say anything at all. The jury, 6 jurors, Washington County doesn't seat 12 for civil guardianship matters, was out for 35 minutes. They found that I was of sound mind, fully capable of managing my own person and financial affairs, and denied the guardianship petition in its entirety. Judge Aldis, before adjourning, did one more thing I'll remember the rest of my life. She ordered the full audit findings referred to the Washington County Prosecutor's Office for review of potential insurance fraud and forgery charges, separate and apart from the now concluded guardianship matter. And she looked directly at Dr. Marcus Sheffield's name on the exhibit list and said she was additionally referring the altered psychiatric report to the State Medical Board for its own independent review. Because a doctor's signature means something in this courtroom, or it means nothing at all, and I don't intend to let it mean nothing while I'm sitting on this bench. Kurt was charged the following February with insurance fraud and forgery, both 4th-degree felonies under Ohio law, given the amount involved. He took a plea, 18 months, of which he served 11 at the Noble Correctional Institution, plus 5 years probation and full restitution, $341,650 to be repaid to the trust over a payment plan that will run, by my math, until he's 62 years old. He surrendered his insurance producer's license permanently. Dr. Marcus Sheffield's altered report resulted in a 2-year suspension of his medical license by the State Medical Board, and I understand, secondhand, that he no longer practices in Ohio. Denise did not go to jail because Denise did not commit a crime.
The prosecutor's office reviewed the case and found no evidence she knew the specific fraud when she filed the petition. Only that she'd been, in the prosecutor's own words to Priscilla, genuinely and tragically misled by her husband about the state of the business she believed she was protecting. She and Kurt separated during his incarceration. As of the recording of this, they are divorced. I want to tell you what my relationship with my daughter looks like now, because I think you deserve the honest ending, not the tidy one. It is not healed. I want to say that plainly, because too many of these stories end with a family hugging in a kitchen, and I don't think that's honest. And I promised you honesty above all else in this telling. Denise and I speak most weeks. She comes to Sunday dinner again, though we've moved it to Saturday lunch, some quiet acknowledgement neither of us has said out loud that Sunday dinner belonged to a version of our family that doesn't exist anymore. She has apologized to me more times than I can count, and I believe every one of those apologies. And I have told her, honestly, that I forgive the fear that made her sign that petition, even as I still carry, and probably always will, the specific grief of my own daughter once asking a judge to declare me unfit. I sold the agency in the spring of 2025 to a young couple out of Athens who reminded me, more than I expected them to, of myself and Lorraine in 1984. Nervous, proud, asking me detailed questions about loss ratios instead of polite ones. I kept the building under the trust and lease it to them. I still stop by Front Street some Fridays, mostly to say hello to Ashlyn, who I hired back, at my recommendation, as their office manager, at a salary I quietly subsidized for the first year, because I believe some debts of gratitude are worth paying even when nobody's keeping score. Kurt wrote to me from Noble Correctional 4 months into his sentence. 1 page. He didn't ask for forgiveness, which I respected more than if he had. He wrote that he understood now that he'd spent 15 years being handed something he never had to earn honestly, a father-in-law's trust, and that the hardest part of prison wasn't the walls. It was finally having enough silence to sit with exactly how much he'd thrown away for a debt that, in the end, cost him more to hide than it would have cost him to simply confess in the first place. I have not written back yet. I think someday I will. Here is what I've learned at 71 years old that I didn't fully understand even after 9 years as a fraud investigator and 41 years running my own agency. They don't come for your money first. They come for your credibility. Every scheme like the one that nearly took my life apart depended, at its core, on convincing the people around me that I couldn't be trusted to know my own mind, because once that's gone, the money follows easily, and so does the house, and so does who gets to decide where you sleep and who's allowed to visit you. And here is the part that costs nothing and takes maybe 20 minutes, and I want you to actually do it today, not just nod along and keep scrolling. Find your own documents. If you have a trust, a power of attorney, a will, pull them out of whatever drawer they're sitting in and read every word, not just the summary your lawyer gave you 15 years ago. If you don't have anything like Article 7 in your own paperwork, a clause that protects you specifically from the people closest to you, not just from strangers, go talk to an elder law attorney this month. It costs a few $100s. You will spend more than that on a set of tires this year without thinking twice. And write down, right now, everyone who has access to your accounts, your medical decisions, your home, everyone who could sign something on your behalf if you couldn't sign it yourself. Ask yourself honestly when you last reviewed what you gave each of them and why. Because here's the hardest truth I carry out of all of this.
and I'll leave you with it exactly as I've come to understand it. The people who take everything from you are almost never strangers. They are, most often, the ones you loved enough to hand them a key at a kitchen table on an ordinary day because it seemed like plain good sense at the time. The only real defense any of us has is to make sure that somewhere, quietly, years before we ever need it, we've built a lock strong enough that even the people we love can't talk us out of using it. I built mine in March of 2013 on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon for a threat I couldn't have named at the time. I hope sincerely that you never need to use one of your own. But if you do, and I've learned more than I ever wanted to, that more of you will than you think, I hope it's already sitting quietly in a drawer, waiting the day you finally need it. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. If it stayed with you, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and whether you've ever checked what's actually written in your own paperwork. I read every one. Take care of yourselves, and go check that drawer.